Franklin Delano Roosevelt, known also as FDR, both during his lifetime and afterwards, was the 32nd President of the United States of America from 1933 to 1945. He is renowned as one of the greatest individuals ever to have occupied the highest office in the United States. And this is well deserved, for Roosevelt led, guided, and shepherded America through one of the most violent and tumultuous periods in human history. During that time, American society would change rapidly, and a considerable portion of that change was due to policies spearheaded and enacted by Roosevelt and the government under him. Many of these policies are still enjoyed by Americans today. Franklin Roosevelt was one of the most influential presidents the United States has ever had, and here his story will be told. Let's begin. Roosevelt was born at the Springwood Estate in Hyde Park, New York, on January 30th, 1882. His parents were Sarah Delano and James Roosevelt. Franklin's mother and father both came from well-to-do families who had been living in America for quite some time. His mother Sarah was descended from French Huguenot settlers, while his father James came from a long-established Dutch family that had been living in the areas of New York City, Long Island, and the Hudson Valley since the mid-17th century. Up to the age of 14, Franklin led a sheltered life. An only child, he grew up mostly in the seclusion of Hyde Park in his family's home. In 1896, Franklin would enter the Groton School in Groton, Massachusetts, a private preparatory high school for boys from wealthy families. Franklin's years at Groton were not the happiest for him, as he had a hard time fitting in with the other students. This experience would be mirrored during his years at Harvard from 1900 to 1904. However, two key events occurred during Franklin's years at Harvard that would prove highly influential on his life. One was the election of his cousin Theodore President of the United States, and the other was the meeting, courtship, and eventual marriage to the woman who would become his famous wife, his cousin Eleanor. Franklin's courtship of Eleanor included one particularly notable experience. While visiting Eleanor one afternoon at the settlement house on Riverview Street in New York City where she taught young immigrant children, one of Eleanor's students suddenly became sick. So sick that Eleanor in fact asked Franklin to carry the little girl back to her home. Franklin performed this kind act, but he was appalled at the conditions of the tenement in which this little girl lived. It was an experience the young Franklin would never forget, and it perhaps foreshadowed the direction many of his efforts as president would eventually go. 1910 was a key year for FDR. His family was growing, and the profession which he had chosen to pursue, law, was beginning to bore him. Roosevelt wanted to pursue something other than being a lawyer. That something was politics and government. And 1910 was the perfect year for him to begin this ambition, because it was a midterm election year. His ambition would prove fruitful. Running as a Democrat for the New York State Senate, Roosevelt won election and was just one of many Democrats who won elections that fall nationwide. From 1913 to 1920, Roosevelt served as Assistant Secretary of the Navy. And in 1920, James M. Cox, the nominee from the Democratic Party for president, would select FDR as his vice presidential candidate. Unfortunately, however, the Democrats would lose in the 1920 presidential election. And Roosevelt, after this, would end up stepping away from politics for about 8 years. In 1928, Roosevelt would return to the political world, winning election as New York's state governor. November 8, 1932. In a landslide victory, FDR defeats the incumbent Republican president, Herbert Hoover. Overnight, the enormous responsibility of leading a nation suffering in the throes of the Great Depression is thrust into Roosevelt's hands. The American people needed a beacon of hope at what was a very bleak time. Unfortunately, they did not feel that Herbert Hoover could be this person. Franklin Roosevelt, on the other hand, could be, and he would prove himself to be for the rest of his life. Roosevelt decided to use the radio as a way of communicating with Americans personally and intimately.
That when you deposit money in a bank, the bank does not put the money into a safe deposit vault. It invests your money in many different forms of credit, in bonds, in commercial paper, in mortgages, and in many other kinds of loans. In other words, the bank puts your money to work to keep the wheels of industry and of agriculture turning round. A comparatively small part of the money that you put into the bank is kept in currency, an amount which in normal times is wholly sufficient to cover the cash needs of the average citizen.
For the average American, likely unemployed and almost certainly suffering in some form of deprivation, these fireside chats would prove to be a source of comfort. One view which Roosevelt held that distinguished him and the Democratic Party he led was the understanding that it was the responsibility and obligation of a government not only to protect its citizens from external forces intent on outright violence and harm, but also from internal evils that often grew out of inequities within a society. This basic mindset and understanding of the responsibility of government was what pushed the New Deal ahead. One thing that must be noted about the New Deal is that it did not create immediate drastic change. For example, while unemployment never again reached its peak of 25% in 1933, it also never dropped below 14% throughout most of the 1930s. For the matter of the economy, it would end up taking World War II and the massive economic stimulus that conflict provided to truly pull America out of the Great Depression. However, what the New Deal ended up doing was setting a long-term precedent for improved economic and social well-being for future Americans. Aided by a government comprising men such as New York Senator Robert Wagner, who shared Roosevelt's ideals of government responsibility for the welfare of its subjects, FDR was able to implement many reforms and policies which Americans know very well today, including the Federal Housing Administration, the Fair Labor Standards Act, the Social Security Act, and many, many more. Franklin Roosevelt would end up leading the United States through the Great Depression and through World War II for a record of 4 terms, the most of any single man who has ever occupied the office in its history. Unfortunately, he would not be able to witness the official end of world hostilities and the official beginning of world peace at the end of the great conflict we know as World War II. On April 12, 1945, Roosevelt died of a cerebral hemorrhage in Warm Springs, Georgia, at the age of 63.